For more than 2 decades, China's dominance in U.S. imports was treated as a permanent feature of the global economy. It shaped how companies built supply chains, how governments approached trade, and how consumers experienced globalization without ever questioning its durability. At its peak in the early 2000s, China supplied roughly 21% of all goods imported by the United States. That figure reflected not just competitiveness, but deep structural dependence that embedded China into the core of the U.S. economic system. American corporations reorganized production around Chinese manufacturing because it offered unmatched scale, speed, and cost efficiency. Over time, this created a model where efficiency was maximized while resilience and diversification were treated as secondary concerns. Today, China's share of U.S. goods imports has fallen to roughly 7%. This decline is not cyclical, temporary, or accidental, but the result of sustained structural change across trade, policy, and corporate strategy. The importance of this shift lies not only in the number itself, but in what it represents. A supply relationship that took more than 20 years to build has been partially unwound in less than half that time. China's export ascent accelerated after its entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. That moment reassured global firms that manufacturing in China would be protected by international trade rules and political stability. Foreign investment flowed rapidly into coastal regions, transforming them into dense manufacturing ecosystems. Ports, highways, industrial zones, and logistics networks expanded faster than almost anywhere else in the world. For the United States, the benefits were immediate and measurable. Lower-cost imports reduced inflation, increased corporate margins, and supported consumer spending across nearly every income group. For China, exports became the engine of employment, urbanization, and economic growth. Tens of millions of jobs were directly or indirectly tied to foreign demand, especially from the U.S. market. As China's export machine expanded, U.S. domestic manufacturing capacity steadily declined. Entire industries hollowed out as production shifted overseas in pursuit of lower costs and higher efficiency. This arrangement worked as long as cost minimization remained the dominant objective. Problems emerged once cost stopped being the only factor that mattered. The first cracks appeared quietly through rising wages inside China. As living standards improved, the labor advantage that once defined Chinese manufacturing began to narrow. Environmental regulations, higher energy costs, and compliance requirements further increased operating expenses. These changes did not eliminate China's competitiveness, but they weakened its overwhelming advantage. At the same time, supply chains became increasingly concentrated. In many industries, a single country accounted for the majority of global production capacity, creating hidden fragility. Geopolitical considerations then began to reshape how governments viewed trade relationships. Supply chains were no longer treated as neutral economic tools, but as strategic assets tied to national security. Concerns grew around dependence in critical sectors such as semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, industrial machinery, and rare earth materials. Policymakers increasingly questioned whether extreme concentration was compatible with long-term stability. Trade tensions in the late 2010s did not create these concerns, but they accelerated them. Tariffs forced companies to reassess supply chains that had previously been optimized purely for cost. Even firms that avoided direct tariff exposure began planning alternatives. Uncertainty itself became a risk that required mitigation. The COVID-19 pandemic then exposed the vulnerability of hyper-concentrated supply chains. Factory shutdowns, port congestion, and shipping delays disrupted global commerce at an unprecedented scale. For U.S. policymakers, the lesson was unavoidable. Dependence on a single manufacturing base created unacceptable risks during crises. For corporations, shareholder priorities began to shift. Resilience, redundancy, and continuity became just as important as cost efficiency. This triggered a gradual but persistent diversification away from China-centered production. Rather than abandoning China entirely, companies pursued parallel manufacturing capacity elsewhere. Mexico emerged as a major beneficiary of this shift. Geographic proximity, lower transport costs, and existing trade frameworks made it an attractive alternative for U.S.-bound production. Southeast Asian economies, such as Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia, also absorbed manufacturing share. These countries offered growing industrial capacity and lower geopolitical risk exposure. India attracted investment in sectors where scale and workforce size mattered more than absolute efficiency. Over time, these shifts accumulated into measurable trade realignment. None of these moves were dramatic individually. Collectively, they reshaped the structure of U.S. imports. As alternatives matured, dependence on China naturally declined. What once seemed irreplaceable became optional. U.S. policy reinforced this trajectory through export controls, investment restrictions, and domestic production incentives. The stated objective was de-risking rather than decoupling, but the economic effect was similar. Manufacturers planning long-term investments prioritized stability over short-term savings. Capital flowed toward supply chains perceived as politically and strategically safer. For China, the impact of this shift has been significant. Export manufacturing supports employment, local government revenue, and industrial ecosystems across multiple provinces. As export demand weakened, pressure increased on factories operating on thin margins. Reduced hours, delayed expansions, and closures became more common in export-heavy regions. At the national level, slower export growth complicated macroeconomic management. Exports had long offset weak domestic consumption and high investment dependence. China's leadership has promoted a pivot toward domestic demand and higher value industries. Progress has been uneven due to structural constraints on household spending. Replacing lost export volume with internal consumption is not straightforward. Consumer confidence, income distribution, and demographic trends limit the speed of transition. The decline from 21% to 7% therefore represents more than trade diversification. It reflects a challenge to China's long-standing growth model. For the United States, the shift delivered strategic flexibility. Reduced reliance expanded policy options during diplomatic and economic disputes. However, diversification also raised costs. Manufacturing outside China often involves higher wages, lower scale efficiency, and more complex logistics. Consumers ultimately bear part of that cost through higher prices. The trade-off is greater resilience and reduced systemic risk. Global trade is no longer governed purely by efficiency. Political alignment, security considerations, and risk management now shape supply decisions. China remains a central player in global manufacturing. It still dominates many intermediate and industrial supply chains. The change lies in leverage rather than relevance. The U.S. is no longer structurally dependent at previous levels. That shift alters negotiating dynamics on both sides. Economic interdependence no longer guarantees political restraint. This transformation did not happen overnight. It is the cumulative result of policy choices, corporate decisions, and external shocks. The era of unquestioned export dominance has ended. What follows is a more fragmented and strategic global trade system. Once supply chains diversify at scale, reversal becomes unlikely. The incentives now favor redundancy over reconcentration. As China's share of U.S. imports declined, its export strategy began shifting toward other regions. Europe, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America became more important as alternative demand sources. However, these markets do not replace the scale or profitability of U.S. consumption. The U.S. market historically absorbed high volumes with relatively stable margins. Competing in emerging markets requires lower pricing and higher financing support. That compresses margins and increases financial strain on exporters. At the same time, global competition intensified. Countries receiving redirected manufacturing investment improved rapidly, reducing China's relative advantage. Mexico strengthened its role as a nearshoring hub for North America. Supply chains shortened, reducing transit risk and inventory costs. Southeast Asian nations expanded industrial capacity with government incentives and infrastructure investment. Their integration into global trade deepened as production diversified. India increased its participation in electronics, pharmaceuticals, and heavy manufacturing. Policy reforms and market size made long-term investment more attractive. As production dispersed, China's bargaining power in trade negotiations weakened. Dependence once flowed in one direction, but that asymmetry diminished. Export-driven employment faced structural pressure inside China. Factory-intensive regions experienced slower income growth and rising labor uncertainty. Local governments felt fiscal stress as land sales and export-linked tax revenue declined. Budget constraints reduced their ability to stimulate growth. China's response focused on upgrading industrial output. Advanced manufacturing, automation, and high-value exports became national priorities. These transitions require time, capital, and technological self-sufficiency. External restrictions increased the difficulty of moving up the value chain. Export controls on advanced technology limited access to critical inputs. This slowed progress in sectors dependent on foreign components. Domestic substitution efforts accelerated but faced efficiency gaps. Replicating mature global supply chains domestically is costly and complex. China also sought deeper regional trade integration. Agreements within Asia aimed to stabilize demand and reduce reliance on Western markets. Yet regional trade often involves intermediate goods rather than final consumption. This limits its ability to replace lost U.S. demand. For U.S. companies, diversification altered cost structures and planning horizons. Supply chains became longer in design but safer in execution. Inventory strategies changed as firms accepted higher holding costs. Reliability became more valuable than just-in-time efficiency. Financial markets adjusted to these realities. Investors began valuing resilience and geopolitical positioning alongside profitability. Manufacturers increasingly disclosed supply chain exposure as a risk factor. Transparency became essential for valuation and compliance. This shift also influenced inflation dynamics. Reduced reliance on ultra-low-cost production contributed to higher baseline prices. Central banks had to account for structural inflation pressures. Monetary policy adjusted in response to less deflationary trade flows. Labor markets reacted unevenly. Manufacturing employment grew in some regions while declining in others. The U.S. saw selective industrial revival supported by subsidies and incentives. However, domestic production remained more expensive than offshore alternatives. Trade policy increasingly reflected strategic alignment rather than neutrality. Friendly nations benefited from preferential treatment and investment flows. This created a new form of economic bloc structure. Trade became more regionalized and politically segmented. China adapted by focusing on scale, efficiency, and speed within remaining markets. Its exporters pursued cost leadership under tighter margins. At the same time, domestic competition intensified. Excess capacity increased pressure across multiple industries. Price competition reduced profitability. This constrained reinvestment and innovation in export-oriented firms. Capital allocation shifted as investors demanded stability. Riskier export-dependent businesses faced higher financing costs. The decline in U.S. import share thus cascaded across multiple layers of China's economy. Trade statistics reflected deeper structural adjustments. For the U.S., reduced dependence enhanced strategic autonomy. Policy choices became less constrained by supply chain vulnerability. However, autonomy came with trade-offs. Higher costs and complexity required careful economic management. Globalization did not end. It changed form. Trade became more intentional and selective. Strategic considerations now shape economic integration. The shift from 21% to 7% symbolizes this transformation. It marks the end of automatic dependence. Future trade relationships will likely remain fluid. Companies will continue balancing cost, risk, and political alignment. China will remain central to global manufacturing, but no longer singular. Multipolar supply chains define the new era. This transformation reduces efficiency, but increases stability. That trade-off now defines global economic policy. What once appeared unthinkable has become normalized. Concentration is now seen as a liability. The global system is adjusting to a slower but sturdier model. Growth is steadier but less explosive. For decades, exports powered China's rise. Now adaptation determines its trajectory. For the United States, diversification reshapes influence. Power increasingly comes from optionality rather than dependence. This shift did not occur because of one decision or one leader. It emerged from cumulative responses to risk. The consequences will unfold over years rather than months. Structural changes rarely reverse quickly. As supply chains reconfigure, new winners and losers will emerge. Economic geography continues to evolve. The story is not about collapse. It is about recalibration. From 21% to 7% is not just a statistic. It is a signal that the global trade order has entered a new phase.